It was a crisp autumn morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The terminal buzzed with its usual morning rush. Travelers dragging their carry-ons, the aroma of overpriced coffee floating through the air, and gate agents making their final boarding calls. Among the crowd was Dave Wilson, a software engineer heading to San Francisco for a tech conference. Dave had done this routine countless times before. Get through security, grab a coffee, answer some emails, and board his flight. Today started just like any other business trip, or so he thought. As he walked down the jet bridge of United Airlines Flight 2478, he pulled out his phone to double-check his seat assignment, 23A, window seat. The plane's interior had that familiar smell of recycled air and new upholstery. Dave made his way down the narrow aisle, dodging elbows and bags from passengers still settling in. He counted the rows, 20, 21, 22, and finally 23. But something felt off the moment he reached his row. An elderly woman, probably in her mid-70s, sat in the aisle seat, wearing an expensive-looking beige cardigan and pearl earrings. The moment she spotted Dave, her body language shifted. Her shoulders tensed, and she clutched her designer handbag closer to her chest, as if it might sprout legs and run away. The middle seat was still empty, but Dave could already feel the tension building. He cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me, ma'am. I have the window seat." His voice was steady and professional, the same tone he used during client meetings. The woman's response, however, wasn't what anyone would expect in 2025. She didn't move. Instead, she stared straight ahead, acting as if Dave was invisible. A flight attendant passing by noticed the small queue forming behind Dave in the aisle. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her name tag catching the overhead light. The elderly woman finally spoke, but her words would turn this routine flight into something entirely different. Little did anyone know, the next few minutes would not only test everyone's patience, but would also become a powerful reminder that karma has perfect timing. The scene was set. The characters were in place, and what happened next would soon capture the attention of millions across social media, sparking a conversation about respect, dignity, and the consequences of choosing hate over humanity. The elderly woman's voice cut through the ambient airplane noise like a knife. "I refuse to sit next to." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked Dave up and down with obvious disdain. "Someone like him." Her words dripped with prejudice, each syllable carefully chosen to wound. Dave stood there, his carry-on handle growing slick in his grip. He'd faced moments like this before, but somehow it never got easier. The line of passengers behind him grew, and he could feel their eyes on his back. Some looked away uncomfortably, while others started pulling out their phones, sensing that something was about to unfold. "Ma'am," Dave said calmly, years of dealing with difficult clients evident in his measured tone, "I just need to get to my assigned seat. We all want this flight to take off on time." He maintained eye contact, refusing to let her prejudice diminish his dignity. But the woman wasn't finished. She jabbed the flight attendant call button repeatedly, the sharp ding echoing through the cabin like an alarm. "I paid good money for this ticket," she announced loudly, her voice getting higher with each word. "I demand to speak to whoever's in charge. I won't sit here. I can't sit here." Other passengers began to murmur. A young woman a few rows back shook her head in disbelief. A businessman in row 21 looked up from his laptop, his face darkening as he realized what was happening. The tension in the cabin was becoming thick enough to cut with a knife. Dave took a deep breath, remembering his mother's words from years ago, "Your dignity isn't determined by their ignorance." He stood straight, professional, and composed, a stark contrast to the woman's increasingly agitated state. The woman continued her tirade, each word more shocking than the last. She pulled out her phone, threatening to call her son, who was a very important lawyer in Boston. She rummaged through her purse, producing a gold membership card. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded, waving the card like a weapon. "I've been flying this airline since before you were born." The other passengers were no longer pretending not to notice. Some had their phones out, recording the incident. A couple in row 24 whispered to each other, their faces a mix of shock and anger, not at Dave, but at the woman's outrageous behavior. The situation was reaching a boiling point. The woman's voice grew louder, her accusations more outlandish. She claimed her bag might not be safe, implying things that made several nearby passengers gasp. She demanded that Dave be removed from the flight, insisting that she had rights and connections. Little did she know, Karma was about to board this flight in the most unexpected way. As she continued her rant, a figure rose from their seat a few rows back. The next few moments would prove that sometimes justice arrives wearing a perfectly pressed airline uniform. Two flight attendants quickly made their way down the narrow aisle, their faces professional but concerned. The lead attendant, a woman with kind eyes and 15 years of experience handling difficult situations, took charge immediately. Her colleague, a younger flight attendant who'd been on the job for just 6 months, stood nearby, ready to assist. "What seems to be the problem here?" the lead attendant asked, her voice calm but authoritative. The question was directed at both parties, but the elderly woman jumped in before anyone else could speak. "I demand a different seat," she exclaimed, her voice shrill enough to carry through the entire cabin. "I cannot and will not sit here. Do you understand? I need to be moved immediately." She was practically shouting now, her face flushed with what appeared to be both anger and embarrassment. The lead attendant glanced at Dave, who hadn't moved from his spot in the aisle. He stood there with remarkable composure, his laptop bag still slung over his shoulder. The younger flight attendant noticed his company lanyard partially visible from his jacket pocket. It was from one of the biggest tech companies in San Francisco. "Sir." The lead attendant addressed Dave quietly, stepping slightly aside to create a small pocket of privacy in the crowded space. "Would you mind telling me what happened?" Dave explained the situation calmly, his voice steady and professional. "I have ticket 23A, the window seat. When I arrived, the lady seemed uncomfortable with my presence. I haven't even had the chance to sit down yet." Meanwhile, other passengers had become unwitting witnesses to the unfolding drama. A mother in row 22 covered her young daughter's ears, trying to shield her from the elderly woman's increasingly inappropriate comments. A group of business travelers a few rows ahead had stopped their conversation about quarterly reports to watch the scene unfold. The lead attendant nodded, understanding the situation completely. She'd seen this before, though not quite this extreme. She turned to her younger colleague and whispered something, sending him quickly up the aisle toward the front of the plane. "Ma'am," she addressed the elderly woman, "I understand you're upset, but I need you to lower your voice. We have a full flight today and—" "I don't care if it's full," the woman interrupted, pulling out her phone again. "I'm going to call the airline's corporate office right now. I know people there, important people." Her hands shook as she tried to dial, her manicured fingers missing the numbers. The lead attendant maintained her professional demeanor, though anyone watching closely could see a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps remembering similar incidents or thinking about her own family members who had faced such treatment. What nobody realized yet was that this situation was about to change dramatically. The younger flight attendant was returning, but he wasn't alone. Behind him walked someone whose presence would transform this uncomfortable scene into something none of the passengers would soon forget. Fate, it seemed, had arranged for a very special passenger to be on board Flight 2478 that day. Sometimes justice arrives not with a bang, but with the quiet click of dress shoes on airplane carpet. The clicking of dress shoes against the airplane's carpeted aisle grew louder. A tall man in a perfectly pressed navy suit made his way forward, his airline executive pin gleaming under the cabin lights. He'd been sitting in row 26, quietly observing the entire situation while conducting his routine flight evaluation. As the regional director of operations, he rarely interfered with standard crew procedures, but today was different. He'd watched the scene unfold with growing concern, his decades of airline experience telling him this was a moment that required direct intervention. "Good morning," he said, his deep voice carrying naturally through the cabin. The elderly woman, who'd been mid-rant about her connections at the airline's corporate office, froze mid-sentence. "I couldn't help but overhear the situation. I'm the regional director of operations for this airline." The woman's expression shifted rapidly, from anger to surprise, then to what looked like smug satisfaction. She straightened her cardigan, clearly believing she'd found an ally. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Finally, someone who'll understand. You see, I'm a long-time Gold member and I simply cannot. Ma'am, the director interrupted gently but firmly, I've been sitting 3 rows back for the past 10 minutes. I've heard and seen everything. He glanced at Dave, who remained standing quietly, his dignity intact despite the woman's behavior. The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the usual airplane background noise seemed to have hushed. A child whispered, "Mom, what's happening?" only to be quietly shushed. Every passenger within earshot leaned slightly forward, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The director adjusted his tie, a small gesture that somehow carried immense authority. In my 25 years with this airline, I've learned that our success depends on one crucial thing: treating every passenger with respect and dignity. The woman's face began to pale, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. She opened her mouth to speak, but the director continued, his voice remaining professional yet carrying an edge of steel. What I've witnessed today isn't just unacceptable, it's against everything our airline stands for. He paused, letting his words sink in. The younger flight attendant stood straighter, clearly impressed by how the situation was being handled. The director's next words would change the entire dynamic of the flight, proving that sometimes karma doesn't just strike, it arrives in a perfectly tailored suit with the authority to make things right. The regional director straightened his suit jacket and delivered his verdict with unwavering authority. Ma'am, this isn't a matter of changing seats. Your behavior today has violated our most fundamental passenger conduct policies. He gestured toward Dave, who remained composed despite everything. This gentleman has every right to his assigned seat and, more importantly, to be treated with respect. The elderly woman's face flushed deep red. She clutched her designer handbag tighter, her knuckles turning white. But I'm a Gold member. I've been flying with this airline for 30 years. Her voice wavered between indignation and panic. Membership status doesn't give anyone the right to discriminate, the director replied firmly. He turned to the lead flight attendant. Please call ground security. They'll assist this passenger in deplaning. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. Deplaning? You can't be serious. She looked around the cabin, searching for support, but found only disapproving faces. A teenager in row 22 wasn't even trying to hide the fact that he was recording everything on his phone. I am entirely serious, the director continued. Furthermore, due to your behavior today, you'll be added to our no-fly list pending review. He held up his hand as she started to protest. This isn't negotiable. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. The reality of the situation finally seemed to hit her. Her shoulders slumped and her voice turned pleading. But my luggage, my connecting flight, my son is expecting me. Our ground team will assist you with retrieving your checked baggage, the director explained calmly. As for alternative travel arrangements, you'll need to make those independently. Our decision is final. 2 ground security officers appeared at the front of the plane, responding to the flight attendant's call. The entire cabin watched in complete silence as they made their way down the aisle. Several passengers had their phones out now, capturing what would soon become a viral moment of justice being served. Dave still stood there, maintaining his dignity. The director turned to him, speaking loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Sir, I want to personally apologize for what you've experienced today. This isn't representative of our airline's values, and we're taking immediate action to address it. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. An older gentleman a few rows ahead nodded firmly in agreement. A young woman wiped away what looked like tears of relief and justice served. The security officers reached their row, their presence professional but unmistakably authoritative. What happened next would become the most shared moment of a video that would soon sweep across social media platforms worldwide. The security officers stood on either side of the elderly woman's seat, their presence both professional and firm. Ma'am, please gather your belongings. We need you to exit the aircraft, the first officer said quietly, trying to maintain the woman's dignity even though she'd shown none to others. The woman's hands trembled as she gathered her designer handbag and small carry-on from under the seat. Her earlier bravado had crumbled, replaced by the dawning realization that her actions had consequences. Her perfectly styled hair was now slightly disheveled, her expensive cardigan wrinkled from her agitated movements. As she stood, she made one last attempt to save face. "This is ridiculous. I'll have my lawyer contact your corporate office." Her voice cracked, betraying her false confidence. The security officers remained unmoved, gesturing toward the aisle. The walk of shame began. Each step down the aisle felt like an eternity. The cabin's silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her heels on the carpet and the occasional click of phone cameras. Every pair of eyes watched her slow progression toward the exit. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8, tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Mom, is this what you meant when you said being mean to others always comes back to you?" The mother nodded, using the moment as a teaching opportunity. Halfway down the aisle, the woman stumbled slightly, her designer shoe catching on the carpet. A flight attendant instinctively reached out to steady her, showing more kindness than she displayed to Dave. The woman's face flushed deeper red at this small act of compassion. The other passengers' reactions told their own story. A group of college students nodded in approval. A grandmother held her grandson closer, perhaps thinking about the world she wanted him to grow up in. 2 businessmen exchanged knowing looks. Justice being served wasn't always comfortable to watch, but it was necessary. As she reached the front of the plane, something unexpected happened. Light applause began somewhere in the middle of the cabin. It spread slowly at first, then gained momentum. It wasn't loud or celebratory. Instead, it carried the weight of collective relief, of right prevailing over wrong. The woman's final steps off the plane were witnessed by every passenger, the moment captured on dozens of phones. No one cheered or jeered. The applause remained dignified, making the message even clearer. Hatred and discrimination had no place here, not in 2025, not ever. The tension in the cabin began to dissolve as soon as she disappeared into the jet bridge. People started talking again, many turning to offer words of support to Dave. The incident would soon become a viral symbol of changing times, but right now, it was simply a moment of humanity asserting itself over prejudice. The videos hit social media before the plane even took off. By the time Flight 2478 landed in San Francisco, the clips had gone viral. One passenger's video, which captured the entire incident from the woman's initial comments to her final exit, had already reached millions of views. The regional director's handling of the situation drew particular praise. His firm stance against discrimination resonated with people worldwide, proving that corporate leadership could do more than just issue statements. They could take real action when it mattered. Dave's phone buzzed constantly after landing. Friends, family, and colleagues had all seen the videos. His calm dignity throughout the incident had struck a chord with viewers. News outlets were reaching out for interviews, but Dave had a different idea. He used the attention to spotlight organizations working to promote equality and understanding. The airline's response was swift and clear. Within hours, they released a statement. "What happened on Flight 2478 reflects our zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. We're proud of our director's immediate action and remain committed to ensuring every passenger feels welcome and respected." They followed through on their words. Dave received an email upgrading him to first class for his next 5 flights. But more importantly, the airline announced expanded training programs for all staff on handling discrimination and bias incidents. The elderly woman's son, the very important lawyer in Boston she'd mentioned, released a public statement distancing himself from his mother's actions. Her behavior was inexcusable, he wrote. "This incident has sparked difficult but necessary conversations in our family about prejudice and accountability." Social media exploded with reactions. The hashtag Flight 2478 trended for days. People shared their own experiences, both painful and hopeful. The incident became a teaching moment in schools and workplaces across the country. One comment on the viral video summed it up perfectly. In 2025, karma doesn't just come around, it flies first class and wears a suit. A week later, Dave boarded another flight. As he walked down the aisle, several passengers recognized him. An elderly couple gestured to the empty seat next to them, smiling warmly. "Would you like to sit here?" they asked. "We'd be honored to hear your story." The incident on Flight 2478 lasted less than 30 minutes, but its impact rippled far beyond that morning in Chicago. It reminded people that standing up against discrimination isn't just about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about ordinary people on ordinary days doing the right thing. And somewhere in Boston, a woman with a designer handbag and a cancelled flight membership card learned that in today's world, karma doesn't just strike, it goes viral.